You've probably wished at some point that you could live without pain. No more headaches. No more stubbed toes. No more aching back after a long day. But what if I told you that a life without pain is not a blessing? It's a slow, invisible curse. And for one boy in small-town Pennsylvania, that curse started the day he was born. This is the true story of Timothy Jacobs, the boy who couldn't feel pain, and why that made him one of the most fragile humans alive. Part 1. The early years Timothy's parents, Mark and Linda, first noticed something was wrong. When he was just 6 months old, he was teething, chewing on his own fingers until they bled, but never crying. They rushed him to the pediatrician, who stitched the small wounds and told them to keep an eye on him. As he grew into a toddler, the incidents got stranger. He'd trip and scrape his knees on the driveway, but instead of wailing like other kids, he'd just get up and keep playing. One day, at age 3, Linda found him sitting calmly in the kitchen, his tiny hand resting on the glowing red coil of the electric stove. His skin was blistering. Timothy was just watching the steam rise from his flesh like it was nothing more than a science experiment. The doctors ran tests for months. Finally, a neurologist delivered the diagnosis: congenital insensitivity to pain with anhidrosis, CIPA, a condition so rare that fewer than 100 known cases existed in the United States. The words barely sank in. The reality hit later. Timothy would never feel pain. Ever. Not from burns, not from cuts, not from broken bones. And without that instinct to avoid danger, every single day of his life would be a battle to keep him alive. Part 2. The invisible threat. By the time he was 7, Timothy had already been to the ER more than a dozen times. A fractured wrist from jumping off the roof of his friend's shed, a deep gash in his leg from climbing a barbed wire fence. Once, he even broke his ankle during a soccer game and kept running on it for 20 minutes. It's only stopping because his coach noticed his foot was hanging at a strange angle. But the most terrifying danger wasn't the injuries. It was infection. Because Timothy didn't feel pain, he often didn't notice when he was hurt. Even a small cut could become septic before his parents realized it. They learned to check his entire body every night, head to toe, looking for swelling, redness, or signs of trauma. It became a grim bedtime ritual. Mark once told a reporter, "We're not afraid he'll get hurt. We're afraid we won't find out in time." Part 3. Teenage rebellion. By the time Timothy hit 13, the nightly checkups and constant warnings from his parents had started to wear on him. Most kids his age rebel by staying out late or skipping homework. Timothy rebelled by pushing the limits of what his body could take. One winter afternoon, he and his friends were sledding on a steep hill near the edge of town. The hill ended in a patch of woods, and everyone knew you had to steer hard to avoid the trees. Timothy didn't steer. He barreled straight down, laughing, until the sled slammed into a trunk with a sickening thud. His friends froze. Timothy just stood up, brushing snow off his jacket, and grinned. But later that evening, during his parents' nightly inspection, they found his thigh grotesquely swollen. The femur was snapped clean in two. After surgery, his doctors explained something chilling. Because he didn't feel pain, his muscles hadn't gone into shock to protect the bone. The break had splintered farther than normal, nearly severing an artery. If the damage had been worse, he could have bled out before anyone realized. Part 4. The hidden enemy inside his body. At 15, Timothy discovered another danger: internal injuries. He joined the high school's junior football team over his parents' desperate objections. "It's just practice," he told them. "We'll be fine." In his second game, he took a hard tackle. He got up immediately, joking with teammates, and played the rest of the match. That night, he vomited twice. His mother thought it might be the flu. By morning, he was pale and sluggish but insisted he wasn't in pain. At the ER, scans revealed a ruptured spleen. He'd been bleeding internally for almost 12 hours. The surgeon later told Mark and Linda that another hour without treatment could have killed him. Timothy shrugged it off, but his parents were shaken to the core. They started lobbying the school to ban him from contact sports. Timothy, of course, hated them for it. "You're making me live in a bubble," he said. But the truth was, the bubble was the only thing keeping him alive. Part 5. The day that changed everything. When Timothy was 17, he decided to take a summer job at a local construction site. It wasn't officially allowed for someone with his condition, but the foreman was a family friend and agreed to let him handle light work. One day, while helping carry plywood up a staircase, he slipped. The sheet corner sliced deep into his forearm. He didn't flinch, didn't drop the board. In fact, he finished the task before even mentioning it. By the time the crew realized how bad the cut was, Timothy's shirt was soaked through with blood. The wound had severed several small arteries, and the blood loss was far worse than it appeared. They rushed him to the hospital, where doctors worked for hours to close the gash and stabilize him. When he woke up, his mother was sitting beside the bed, holding his hand. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she whispered, "You won't get another chance like this. Can't keep living like nothing will hurt you, 'cause something will." Part 3. The winter that almost took him. It was the kind of winter afternoon kids dream about. The kind where the snow is soft. The sky is pale gray, and the air feels still, like the whole world is holding its breath. The hill outside of Maple Street had been packed down by dozens of sled runs from neighborhood kids. And Timothy was at the top, grinning in a way that made his best friend Kyle nervous. "You gonna steer this time?" Kyle asked, leaning on his red sled. Timothy shook his head. "What's the fun in that?" He positioned his sled, a beat-up plastic thing with cracks in the sides, right in the deepest track, the one that went straight toward the tree line. Most kids avoided it after 2 close calls earlier in the week. But for Timothy, danger was only a word. It had no bite, no sting. Kyle muttered, "You're insane." But Timothy was already pushing off. The sled picked up speed instantly, snow spraying into the air like tiny shards of glass. The cold wind slapped Timothy's face, but there was no thrill of fear, just the rush of motion. The trees at the bottom grew larger, darker, and closer. The other kids shouted from the top, some cheering, some yelling for him to bail out. He didn't. The moment before impact was almost beautiful. The soft hush of snow under the sled, smell of pine in the freezing air. Then the violent crack of plastic and bone meeting solid oak. To Timothy, it felt like nothing more than a jolt, like tripping on a sidewalk. He stood up immediately, brushing off snow, laughing as if he'd just pulled off a prank. But his sled lay crumpled, the front twisted at a grotesque angle. "Dude, are you— oh my God," Kyle's voice cracked. He was staring at Timothy's leg. Timothy followed his gaze. His thigh was already swelling under his jeans, the fabric stretching tight. He tried to take a step, and his leg folded under him like a broken hinge. Still, no pain, just an odd, hollow weakness. The other kids were frozen, unsure whether to help or run for an adult. It was Kyle who snapped out of it first. "I need to get your mom," he said, his voice sharp. By the time Linda arrived, Timothy was sitting in the snow, still grinning, still treating it like a joke. But when she saw the way his leg bent, not at the knee, but midway down the thigh, her face went pale. The drive to the hospital felt endless. Linda kept glancing over from the driver's seat, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Timothy, meanwhile, was poking at the swelling, curious more than concerned. At the ER, the X-rays confirmed a complete femur fracture, with the bone splintering near the break.
Ow.
One of the shards had come dangerously close to piercing an artery.
Ow.
The orthopedic surgeon told Linda that if it had nicked the vessel, Timothy could have lost consciousness in minutes. That night, lying in the hospital bed with his leg in traction, Timothy stared at the ceiling. His mother sat beside him, eyes red from crying. "You think you're lucky because you don't feel pain?" she said softly. "But luck runs out." Part 4. Friday night lights and the silent hit. By the time Timothy was 16, his lack of pain wasn't just a strange medical condition, it had become part of his identity. In his small Pennsylvania town, word had gotten around. That S, the kid who can feel a thing. It was fall now, the air crisp and sharp with the smell of wet leaves and wood smoke. The high school football field was lit up like a stage, and Timothy, wearing number 12, was in the center of it all. He'd joined the team not for glory or love of the game, but for the simple fact that it was dangerous. Everyone else wore layers of padded armor to soften the hits. For Timothy, it was just an inconvenience between him and the impact. The game was halfway through the third quarter when it happened, so the opposing team's quarterback faked a handoff and rolled to the right. Timothy, playing defense, spotted an opening and charged. His cleats tore at the grass, breath clouding in the cold air. The quarterback released the ball just before Timothy slammed into him helmet to chest, full force. The crowd roared, the whistle blew, and for a moment it felt like any other tackle. But when Timothy stood up, the world tilted. His vision blurred for a second before sharpening again. He shook it off and jogged back to the huddle. "You good?" Kyle, now his teammate, asked, eyeing him warily. "Yeah," Timothy smirked. Just barely felt it. He didn't notice the way his left side wasn't moving quite right, or the faint hitch in his breathing. Didn't notice the ache building inside, not because it wasn't there, but because his body never told him. For the next 10 minutes, he kept playing, charging, tackling, even taking another hard hit to the ribs. It wasn't until the coach yanked him out that anyone realized something was seriously wrong. "You're pale as hell," the coach said, crouching beside him on the bench. "Lift your jersey." Ow. When Timothy pulled up the fabric, a hush fell over the sideline. From his ribs down to his waist, his skin was darkening, blooming with a deep purple bruise that seemed to grow as they watched. The trainer didn't wait. He shouted for the medic. Within minutes, Timothy was being loaded into an ambulance, oxygen mask pressed to his face. The EMT's voice was calm but urgent as he spoke to the driver. "Possible internal bleed. Step on it." At the hospital, scans confirmed that his spleen had ruptured. Every bump and jolt during the ride had pushed more blood into his abdominal cavity. A surgeon was called in immediately. Later, when Timothy woke up in recovery, groggy from anesthesia, his mother was there again. Her voice was shaky. "You could have died out there, Tim." He shrugged, still trying to turn it into a joke. "Guess I'll stick to checkers." But deep down, if he wouldn't admit it, there was a flicker of something new. A shadow of fear. Part 5. The fall after the football injury. Timothy promised his mother he'd be more careful. But promises like that, for someone who'd never learned to fear pain, were thin as paper. 2 years later, he was 19 and working part-time at a local construction site. The pay was good for someone fresh out of high school, and he liked the crew. They were the kind of guys who laughed loud, swore often, and made a game out of dangerous work. Timothy fit right in. The job that week was framing the second story of a new office building downtown. The air smelled of cut lumber and diesel fumes from the generator. Nails glinted in coffee cans scattered across the floor. Sunlight poured through gaps in the unfinished walls, turning the dust in the air into shimmering gold. It was just before lunch when the foreman yelled for someone to help with the trusses. Timothy was closest, so he climbed the ladder without hesitation, a 20-pound nail gun hanging from his tool belt. The roof beams were slick from a morning drizzle, he noticed, but didn't think twice. "Careful up there," one of the guys called from below. Timothy grinned. "Always am." The first few minutes were fine nailing, adjusting, working in rhythm with the others. But then his boot slipped. Just a fraction of an inch, enough to shift his balance. His hands reached for the nearest support beam, but the nail gun caught on the edge, jerking him sideways. The next moments were a blur of sky and wood and empty air. He landed on his right side, hard enough that the scaffolding rattled. The crew froze. "You okay?" someone shouted. Timothy sat up, brushing sawdust from his hair. Yeah, didn't even feel it. But as he stood, the world swam again. His right leg wobbled strangely, bending in a way it wasn't meant to. He ignored it at first, limping back toward the work area. That's when one of the guys, a heavy-set man named Rourke, grabbed his arm. "Sit down now." When Timothy looked down at his jeans, the color drained from his face, not because of pain, but because of the way the denim clung darkly to his thigh. Blood, a lot of it. One of the nails from his belt had driven into his own leg when he landed. The wound wasn't small, it was deep enough that muscle peeked through. The worst part? He'd been walking on it for a full minute without realizing. The foreman called an ambulance. Timothy insisted it was just a scratch, even as the paramedics cut his jeans open to treat the gash. At the ER, the doctor shook his head. "You're lucky it didn't hit the artery. If it had, you might have bled out before you even knew you were hurt." For most people, that would have been the wake-up call. For Timothy, it was just another story to laugh about later. Part 6. The fire by 23. Timothy had already racked up more hospital visits than most people twice his age. Sprains, cuts, broken bones, none of them fazed him. But the incident that would finally shake him began on a bitterly cold January night. He was working late at a small machine shop on the edge of town. The place smelled of oil and scorched metal, the hum of old industrial fans echoing in the rafters. Most of the crew had left hours earlier, but Timothy stayed behind to finish welding a batch of steel brackets. Around midnight, the shop was quiet except for the hiss of the welding torch. Outside, the wind howled against the corrugated steel walls. Inside, a faint whiff of something different cut through the normal workshop scent smoke. Timothy looked up. A small patch of flame licked the far wall near the breaker box. Sparks must have caught on the old insulation. For most people, the sight of fire would trigger instant alarm. For Timothy, it was just interesting. He set down his torch, walked over, and started patting the flames out with his welding glove. It didn't work. The heat bit into the leather, the material curling and blackening in seconds. Still, he felt nothing. What he didn't notice was the molten plastic dripping onto his sleeve. Within moments, his work shirt was smoldering. A coworker, Mike, had come back to grab his forgotten phone and froze in the doorway. "Tim, your arm." Timothy glanced down. The fabric was glowing red, charred holes spreading across the cotton. He could smell the sharp chemical stink of burning skin. He didn't feel it, but he saw it. Mike sprinted across the shop, tearing off his own jacket and smothering the flames. "Are you insane? You didn't even flinch?" By then, the fire on the wall had grown. The orange glow reflected in the steel beams above. They pulled the alarm and evacuated, the sound of sirens growing in the distance. Outside, in the freezing night, Timothy finally began to shiver, not from pain, but from the sight of his arm. The skin was raw, blistering in patches. The ER doctor later told him it was a second-degree burn. "You're going to lose more than skin one day," the doctor said grimly. "You won't feel the warning signs until it's too late. Infections, internal injuries, you name it. You need to start treating your body like it can be hurt, even if your nerves don't tell you." Timothy nodded, but the truth was, he didn't know if he could. Pain wasn't just absent, it was something he couldn't even imagine. Part 7. The fall spring came early that year. The snow melted fast, leaving the back roads slick with mud. Timothy, now 24, had been helping Mike renovate an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The job was nothing special, ripping up floorboards, replacing joists, but the money was steady. And Mike liked having someone who never complained about sore muscles. That morning, the air smelled faintly of rain, and a mist clung to the hills. They were working on the second story, prying up rotted planks. The house had no safety railings, just open air, where a balcony would eventually be rebuilt. Timothy was kneeling near the edge, hammer in hand, when one of the joists under him cracked. Mike shouted a warning, but the sound was swallowed by the creak of wood giving way. The board split, and Timothy dropped straight through the gap. It was an easy 12-foot fall onto a patch of gravel and broken boards below. Mike scrambled down the ladder, heart pounding. When he reached him, Timothy was already sitting up, brushing sawdust off his shirt. "Guess I misjudged my footing," he said casually. Mike stared. "Tim, your leg." Timothy followed his gaze. Da-da-da-da. His right leg was bent in a way legs aren't supposed to bend. The shin bone was pushing hard against the skin, a pale shape under torn flesh. There was no screaming, no groaning, just that same blank calm. "We need to get you to the hospital," Mike said, his voice sharp. But Timothy insisted on finishing what he was doing. "Doesn't even hurt. Let's just tape it or something." Mike nearly lost it. "Tape it. You have a compound fracture." By the time they got him to the ER, he had walked half the way to the truck, leaning on a 2x4 like a crutch. The doctor later said that every step could have shredded arteries, risking massive blood loss. They patched him up, but the orthopedic surgeon warned him point blank, "One day, it won't just be a broken bone. It'll be something that kills you before you even know it's serious. You think pain's an inconvenience, but it's the only thing that tells us when to stop." Timothy nodded politely, but he couldn't feel fear any more than he could feel pain. Part 8. The last winter. It happened in January. The cold that year was cruel, the kind that made the trees groan at night and froze water in the pipes solid. Timothy had been helping a neighbor, Mrs. Keenan, clear out an old shed behind her house. It was the sort of job no one else wanted, dark, damp, full of rusted tools and rotting wood. But Timothy never minded. The shed had no electricity, so he worked with a kerosene lamp for light. In one corner, he found a nest of old nails and jagged sheet metal buried under straw. As he shifted it, one piece slipped and caught his side. It was a deep cut. Anyone else would have dropped everything, clamped their hand to the wound, and run for help. Timothy barely glanced at it, kept working another 2 hours, sweeping, hauling, stacking wood. By the time he went home, the cut was bleeding steadily. But because there was no pain, no burning sting, he didn't think about it. He ate dinner, he read a book. He went to bed. What he didn't feel was the fever setting in overnight. The bacteria from the rusted metal were already in his bloodstream, moving fast. The next morning, Mrs. Keenan saw him in the yard. He was pale, but smiling faintly. "Guess I caught a bug," he said, swaying slightly as he stacked firewood. By noon, he collapsed. Mike rushed over when he heard. He found Timothy lying in the snow, his breath shallow, skin cold and clammy. The cut on his side was swollen, the flesh angry and dark. The hospital tried everything for antibiotics, fluids, oxygen, but the infection had spread too far, too fast. Septic shock had set in. The doctor later told Mike if he'd come in last night, we might have saved him, but without pain. He never knew how bad it was. Timothy died that evening, 26 years old. At the funeral, Mike stood beside the closed casket. Remembering the boy who had once smiled while blood ran down his arm, who could break a bone and keep walking? He realized then that pain isn't just suffering, it's a warning. Timothy had lived his whole life without that warning, walking blind through a minefield until, inevitably, he stepped on the wrong one. Asterisk, pain is the enemy until you lose it.
Ow.
Then you learn it was never the enemy at all. It was the one thing that whispered stop, rest, healed. Before the damage became permanent, Timothy never had that voice. His body was a silent battlefield, and every wound was a hidden landmine. He laughed when others cried, stood when others fell. But in the end, it wasn't strength that kept him going. It was silence. And silence can be deadly. Some people live in fear of pain. But maybe. Pain is what keeps us alive long enough to fear anything at all. The boy who couldn't feel it, he was never afraid. And that's why he's gone.